Hello and welcome to my psychological book review series where I review books from a psychological perspective. As a psychotherapist, I love to consume literature and make it applicable for the everyday person, borrowing psychological themes, talking a little bit about clinical examples and how it all relates and makes sense. So today I decided to pick up Irvin Yalom's When Nietzsche Wept, a book that was written in 1992 and is chock full of really interesting philosophical and psychotherapeutic tidbits and nuggets and whatever descriptor you want to place in there, because it was a fascinating read. What I do want to say is, if you enjoy my book review series, please do subscribe. It really does help the channel out. As a person who manages all this sort of stuff by myself as a kind of passion project, I really would love your help subscribing, liking the videos that you do like, sharing them around with friends, and just moving forward in that vein to help get the word out. But enough of that plug. What I do want to say is let's get on into it. And I want to start off by actually going to the back of the book. In the afterword he says, and I quote, "Years ago, in an essay about the writing of When Nietzsche Wept, I cited a phrase from André Gide, who says, 'History is fiction that did happen, whereas fiction is history that might have happened.'" A felicitous phrase, I thought, and wrote, "Fiction is history that might have happened." Perfect. That was precisely the fiction I wanted to write. My novel, When Nietzsche Wept, could have happened. Given the very improbable history of the field of psychotherapy, all the events of this book could have come to pass if history rotated only slightly on its axis. I think this is an important place to start because it really is a process of, it's almost like his passion project. He started to write this not long after he wrote Love's Executioner. And Love's Executioner is a whole book related to some of the stories that came about from his clinical practice. Irvin Yalom is a psychotherapist, a existential psychotherapist who wrote a really dense and informative but also very engaging and interesting book called Existential Psychotherapy. So there's a no-brainer there. So he's very, very influenced by philosophical themes as they relate to psychotherapy, and he especially draws on a lot of the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, who is a philosopher who died in the 1900s, who has, as we will find in this book, an intense and immense and really profound story that influences his very practical philosophy, but also psychology, because he really does try to bring out a applicability that people can engage with from a psychological point of view to improve their life and grappling with deep philosophical themes. This story in itself, When Nietzsche Wept, was inspired, as Yalom points out at the back of his book, by the story of two healers. And what I'm going to do is I will read for you this story, which comes up in Hermann Hesse's novel, Magister Ludi, which tells the story of two renowned healers. And let's see where it goes. There were two renowned healers, one of whom lived in North India and the other in the southern part of the subcontinent. Though they were both powerful healers, they worked in different ways, one through offering sagacious advice, and the other through quiet and inspired listening. So, one loves his advice giving, the other one likes to listen. Both really important psychotherapeutic themes just in that point of view. Though they never met, they worked as rivals for many years until the younger healer, the one who lived in the north, grew spiritually ill and fell into despair. So the younger one, the one who was very fond of giving advice, he decided that the advice he was offering to others just didn't quite work for himself, and he became spiritually, philosophically, experimentally ill in terms of his own way forward. What he does is he journeys on a pilgrimage, and one evening he settles into an oasis and falls into conversation with an older traveler to whom he describes the purpose and goal of his pilgrimage. He says that I really need to find this other healer that I hear so much about, and I need to kind of pick his brain on what it is that I'm going through and how to get out of this depth of despair that I'm currently facing. The older man replies, "Oh, this is indeed a miracle. I am the very man you seek." Without hesitation, the older healer invites his younger rival into his home, and they live and work together for many years, first as student and then as teacher, and then as full colleagues. Years later, the older man falls ill, and on his deathbed calls his young colleague to him. "I have a great secret to tell you," he says. "It's the secret I've been holding for a very long time. Do you remember that time where we met at that oasis and how you told me that you were coming to see me? You were feeling really unwell." The younger guy's like, "Yeah, of course I remember that. How could I forget that night? It was that turning point, that catalyst of my entire life. It's not something you easily forget, man." The dying man takes his hand and he says, "I got a secret to tell you. My secret is I was too in despair, and I was actually making my way to see you." This is a tale that moved Irvin Yalom in a preternatural way, he describes. He says it's an illuminating statement of giving and receiving help, honesty and duplicity, and being true to what it is that you're doing. He says that the younger healer was nurtured, nursed, taught, mentored, and parented, and the older healer serving the younger healer through obtaining a disciple from whom he received filial love, respect, and salve for his isolation, his own isolation, that sense that we can all go through. Perhaps the real therapy occurred at the deathbed scene when they moved into honesty. Honesty being one of the most important things to help a person move forward, because when you're not honest, firstly to yourself, and secondly to the people around you that would benefit from your own honesty, then you've got a deep and longing despair that truncates your move forward. And that's a really important place to start this book. And as we move forward, we'll start to see how these themes begin to rise in his story. So let's get to it. The story starts in a beautiful Venetian cafe where Joseph Breuer, who is a Venetian physician, he is sitting there sipping on his coffee, and he wonders, how much of life have I missed simply by failing to look, or by looking and not seeing? He is having a bit of an existential crisis there, where he continues to try to picture what it is that he is all about. He has got a very satisfying career, he's got a beautiful wife, he's got wonderful children, he is an incredible researcher, he's developed a really interesting therapy to assist someone called Berta Poppenheim, later written about with Sigmund Freud, who, again, as both of these being progenitors to the current psychotherapeutic movement and then the discipline of psychotherapy and psychology. And this lady was termed Anna O at the time. So this man has many, many things, and yet he's still pondering. And we often get to that point where we've achieved, we're on that sense of, I've done a lot in my life, and yet I'm still struggling to make sense of what's going on. And if we find ourselves to this place, it's often when we hit a plateau. We've risen, and then we plateau, and in that plateau we ask these questions. Who am I? What am I all about? Where am I coming from? These existential questions that we really need to ponder, because if we don't, we'll find ourselves wading through the shores of uncertainty and failing to figure out where we are willing to drive forward to. And this is what we see with Joseph Breuer. Now, Joseph Breuer was a real person, just putting that out there, very active in the 1800s, and this book is set in 1882. So all of this happens within a matter of months in 1882. Breuer is approached by a woman called Lou Salome, and Lou Salome is a good friend of a philosopher at the time called Friedrich Nietzsche, who she suspects is becoming very, very despondent and suicidal because of a whole range of things. He's going through a massive illness, and there's no way to move forward. He is going through an intense amount of physiological symptoms, but he's also a very profound philosopher. And Lou Salome has had a really difficult relationship with Friedrich Nietzsche. She also is a historical person of which Nietzsche proposed a marriage to, and she denied, and they have kind of like a platonic relationship that Nietzsche was always searching for, but never quite secured until he met her. But as they met together and their friendship ensued, he began to attach to her, and she began to pull away, but she never lost her care for him. And they had a big argument, and she's coming to Breuer on the guise of finding help for Nietzsche, but trying to do this surreptitiously without Nietzsche finding out that this is going on. What she says in describing Nietzsche, she says that he terms himself as a posthumous philosopher, a philosopher for whom the world isn't ready yet. In fact, the new book he's planning begins with that theme. A prophet, Zarathustra, bursting with wisdom, decides to enlighten the people, but no one understands his words. They just aren't ready for him, and the prophet, realizing he's come too soon, returns to his solitude. This in itself, this book was based before Thus Spaketh Zarathustra. That's a bit of a tongue-tire, which was suspected to be a real prophet back thousands of years before Nietzsche was writing. And Nietzsche kind of uses this person as a model for someone who comes out, speaks intense wisdom, but no one understands, and they kind of just laugh him out and saying, what the hell is this person talking about? And he goes by his way and saying, well, these people just don't understand. And we've all had those experiences where we really are bursting at the seams, trying to tell somebody else about something that is really important for us. I suspect we've all had these experiences, and yet other people just don't see the reality of what that means for their own life. And if they don't see that reality of what that means for their own life, then they have a very difficult time taking stock of what you are saying or what somebody else is saying, and you have difficulty taking stock of what they are saying. Salome continues, and she says, hey, listen, I heard about you through my brother who was studying in one of your lectures, and you talked about a lady called Anna O, a woman who was in despair and who you treated with a new technique called the talking cure, a cure that's based on reason, on the unraveling of tangled mental associations. Is this something that you can really help me with? Because we know that Anna O was afflicted with hysteria, and she suffered from certain disabling symptoms. I'm reading from the book here. And Breuer goes on to say, well, my approach consisted of systematically wiping out each symptom by helping my patient to recall with the help of mesmerism, another word for hypnosis or a hypnotic trance, or just a very relaxed state, kind of like a mindfulness state. And through mesmerism, the forgotten psychic trauma in which it originated, that comes to light. And once this specific source is identified and uncovered, the symptom tends to dissolve. Breuer is incredibly uncertain about despair, which is what Nietzsche is going through and what Salome wants to get some help for him on. He's very skeptical on whether this kind of approach would even help. He says to her, despair is not a medical symptom, Fräulein. It's a vague, imprecise experience. Each of Anna O's symptoms involved some discrete part of her body. Each was caused by the discharge of intracerebral excitation through some neural causeway. Basically, that's just smart speak for something that's going on in the human brain from a electrical point of view, brain cells communicating with each other. He's like, hey, this is what's going on, and once we identified this, that part of the brain was able to resolve the issue, and then things went well. But despair, how the heck is despair going to work in using this particular cure, this talking cure? But Lou Salome would not rest until she got some until she got the answers she was seeking. In fact, she convinces Breuer that this is a good idea. She would find a way to send Nietzsche to him, and everything will be resolved because there's something that Breuer has, that Lou Salome sees in a Breuer, that Breuer perhaps hasn't even seen himself, that could help Nietzsche. And thus the book continues and the journey begins. So we've got Joseph Breuer and we've got Lou Salome. Lou Salome makes her entrance at the beginning of the book and then it fades off and the book continues. And then another character enters, Sigmund Freud, who, again, historical person, but he's quite a young man in his 20s in this book. And also you've got Matilda, which is Joseph Breuer's wife. Freud and Breuer, they have a good connection, as well as Matilda and Freud. They get along really well together, and Freud frequents the house of Breuer and they discuss things relating to what happened during the day and what they've been doing from a therapeutic point of view, also from a medical point of view. And Freud is portrayed as somebody who the medical system is almost like an encumbrance to his interests in dreams and wanting to help people from a psychotherapeutic point of view. And so he peppers Breuer with questions about Breuer's experimentation with Bertha Pappenheim, Anna O, as you would read in the history books, and the talking cure. And at the time, in fact, Breuer only conducted this cure, so to speak, once, and it was only with Anna O, Bertha. What we see is that he went into it, he experimented, he got some pretty good results, and then he left it and went on to do his own work. It was Freud who picked up the baton and continued to shine the light into the utility of these types of approaches and created his own theories of sexual drives and motivational drives and dream analysis and these sorts of things. So I want to read a quote from a conversation with Breuer and Freud, where Breuer is describing a little bit around his interactions with Bertha. He says this: "You know, of course, Sig, that Bertha had all these typical symptoms of hysteria. Sensory and motor disturbances, muscular contractions, deafness, hallucinations, amnesia, aphonia, phobias, and also unusual manifestations as well. For example, she had some bizarre linguistic disturbances, being unable for weeks on end to speak German, especially in the mornings. We held our conversations in English. Even more bizarre was her dual mental life. One part of her lived in the present, and another part responded emotionally to events that had occurred exactly 1 year before. She also had severe facial neuralgia, which nothing but morphia could control, and of course, she became addicted." In describing Bertha's symptoms, you have the diagnosis that is no longer used in today's medical paradigm of psychiatric or psychological consulting, hysteria, where they're very real body-based type symptoms that come from psychological issues. And we see this, that when we identify the psychological issues, then the physical symptoms tend to move away. There's an interesting case that is detailed in the book Mindsight. Daniel J. Siegel is a neuroscientist and a psychotherapist who explores one instance where there was a lady who visited him who had intense lower back pain. And she was on the verge, she was young, in her 20s, and she had scheduled some surgery to help with this pain. And she thought, I'll just see a therapist. And she researched a good therapist, and he came up and he saw her. What happened was that she described to him what her lower back pain was like. And then he did what was called a body scan and just asked her to to relate to him what it is that came up when she just scanned different parts of her body and closed her eyes and started to notice what was going on in her body. When she got to her lower back, a memory flooded in where she was in the basement with an older man who had pushed her against against the back of a billiard table rather, and the billiard table just dug into her back, and I can't recall whether she was raped or whether she escaped that, but that led to pain that emulated from that she'd otherwise blocked out. And then as soon as that connection was made with Daniel Siegel, that pain disappeared. Let's go back to the book. Josef Breuer continues, and he says that the process of chimney sweeping, so to speak, took time. Chimney sweeping, the talking cure, Bertha called it chimney sweeping, where she would just clear her thoughts. What anything that she was thinking that day, she would just let loose and tell Breuer what was on her mind. And he says this: often Bertha required an hour every morning of what she called chimney sweeping, just to clear her mind of dreams and unpleasant fantasies. And then when I returned in the afternoon, new irritants had built up, requiring further chimney sweeping. I mean, this is a pretty intensive process where they're meeting every single day, every single morning, to try to figure out what's going on and to just let loose. And this shows the power of discussion and talking with somebody who you trust, somebody that you love, so to speak, in a very deep way, somebody that you can confide in. And this is where the counseling relationship comes in. And for anybody who hasn't tried a counseling relationship, it's worth a look at. And if you can't do counseling for whatever reason, it's good to find somebody that you can just test the waters and reveal something about yourself, something that's troubling you, and see how they respond. And if they're people who can reflect back to you and just hear what you're saying, you start to see how this can be really helpful. Back in the 1800s, in that Victorian era, where they prided themselves on regulating their emotions and on self-control, self-regulation, willpower. These sorts of things weren't widely practiced. So that's why these sorts of approaches became revolutionary in a sense and expanded to the nth degree when it comes to Freud's work that came from Breuer, and this is a really interesting inception of the psychotherapeutic deliverables, so to speak. I think that's a really cool one, because this book, though it's fiction, though this historical book is fiction, it traces back the beginnings of psychotherapy. So anybody interested in how psychotherapy became what it became, this would be a good book to read. Let me quote: "We found that when she went back to the very source of a symptom and described it all to me, then that symptom disappeared on its own, with no need of any hypnotic suggestion." And that's pretty much what I've been describing up until date. Identify and then see what happens. In fact, when a person receives a diagnosis of something that hasn't been diagnosed up until that point, there's an incredible relief just by knowing what that thing is. Whether that's something that you haven't been able to identify and you've been living with for years and years and years, or a mental health issue that someone just describes, yeah, we know what this is. This is something that many people experience. And you're like, oh, I'm not just crazy. It's a very real sense of relief that comes from there. And in Bertha's case, it reduced and released her body's pent-up energy that it was holding and changed things for her. Quite intense. 1 hour every single day, probably 2 hours a day, morning and afternoon. I'm not sure many people can stand that though. Freud responds, "It's beautiful. The theoretical implications are breathtaking and entirely compatible with I'm going to have trouble saying this word, Helmholtzian Theory. Once the excess cerebral electrical charge responsible for symptoms is discharged through emotional catharsis, then the symptoms behave properly and promptly vanish. So this is an interesting one. Your brain works on electrical charges. There's positively and negatively charged ions that are powered by things like sodium and potassium within the human brain, and the neurons within the human brain require these electrical charges to filter through the synapse, which is that little gap between each brain cell, to communicate a message. And when these messages are communicated, that's when the brain considers and thinks for itself and passes on messages, and you're able to move your hand up and down and look at a particular thing and think a particular thought and access a particular memory. Hermholtzian theory, based on this reading, is that there's an emotional charge, an electrical charge that builds and builds and builds within the human brain and kind of gets stuck there. And when it is identified that this is the issue, that charge is identified and it is released, and therefore that experience is no longer building up. I mean, it's another interesting parallel with Peter Levine's somatic experiencing, where he discusses energy that tends to build up within the human body and create tension and traumatic experiences or traumatic symptoms like body-based tensions, and kickstarts your sympathetic nervous system, which accelerates your heart rate, your breathing rate, your blood clotting abilities. Epinephrine just increases your body's ability to clot, and it diverts energy from different body systems to give rise to the glucose that's required in the body system that you need, whether that's your legs to run away or your arms to fight or your lungs to breathe. You don't need to digest anything when you're staring down the barrel of a loaded gun. And what I would say is that somatic experiencing, though energy is a bit woo-woo for me and many others, I think it's important to reframe that and say that the body can keep tension, and it can have this type of tension over time that is really difficult to get rid of. And only once we identify the issue that is plaguing us and address it from a body-based point of view, that's when it works. Let me tell you a little bit more about the body-based point of view, because I think that's important to feed on here. Somatic psychotherapy is like Peter Levine's somatic experiencing. Body-based therapies that try to access information about what the person's feeling inside their body to understand it from a trauma-based point of view. So an example could be you see a red car driving past and your heart rate just fully increases and you have no idea why that's happening. And it turns out upon further investigation that when you were a child, you had a car accident and a red car was involved, and you have little memory of this, but it can be confirmed through other means. And once that is identified, and then you're able to access your body and focus on your heart and respond in ways that your body felt like it needed to respond back in that time. So for example, if your heart rate's increasing, then that means that your body's sympathetic nervous system is underway trying to get you to do something. So, and you might feel tension from the waist up, and you might need to fight a particular stressor, or from the waist down, you might feel like you need to run away, or your body feels like it needs to freeze up, or it may even faint in certain circumstances. And whenever we stop these experiences from happening, or ignore them, or try to get rid of them in certain ways, like a memory comes up and we try to stifle it, we try to forget about it, or your body feels like it needs to do something, you need to scream, and then you just stifle that scream because it's not socially appropriate to scream in the middle of the shopping center and cause all this hullabaloo and attention to yourself. I mean, who wants to do that? But often we humans have become really adept at stifling our emotional experiences more than what animals do. And somatic experiencing therapies or somatic-based psychotherapies like sensory motor psychotherapy, which was developed by Pat Ogden, who in the 1970s served as a yoga internist at a hospital and made a whole bunch of observations about how people carry a lot of their stress and their tension in their bodies. And in fact, I was speaking with another yoga specialist by the name of Jill Miller, who is really into understanding what's going on in the human body from a biological point of view and a trauma-based point of view. And she utilizes a scientist called Stephen Porges. His polyvagal theory to understand how the nervous system reacts in response to threat and how that can become stored in the body and how this can really influence our day-to-day. But this is a whole big topic we can spend hours and hours and hours on discussing. So moving back into what's actually going on in the book, Freud is incredibly flabbergasted and surprised, but also encouraged to say that this is a really good way of approaching these issues of hysteria. And you really need to look at this more, Breuer, because if you're finding your therapy is working in this way, we need to share this and we need to study this and we need to work with this. The narrative moves forward and Breuer meets Nietzsche for the first time and they get to talking and he does an observation of what Nietzsche is going through. And this is striking. This is all fact-based, so we get a glimpse of what this remarkable philosopher had experienced in his life. And before we'll get to reading his symptoms, Nietzsche's that is, we want to look at what Breuer was influenced by. He was so interested in how engaging in a thorough examination of a person's experience brings back a sense of, hey, I'm being heard. I understand what's going on. Somebody wants to understand what's going on with me. And what Breuer says is, and I quote, "The joy of being observed ran so deep that Breuer believed the real pain of old age, bereavement, outliving one's friends, was the absence of scrutiny, the horror of living an unobserved life." What this looks like is that as we age, we have less people taking an interest in who we are, what we've experienced and what we've done. And this can lead us into the pit of despair. And in fact, it can bring up a whole range of issues from a very physical point of view, the issues of being neglected and depression and letting go of ourselves. And we see this a lot in the elderly, who, although are living a lot longer over the past few decades, tend to have higher levels of unhealthy living years, which is to say that they're living longer, but they're in higher straits of pain and they have higher levels of depression and anxiety than the ordinary population, the general population, which is a devastating thing to experience. Breuer smacks this on the head. The joy of being observed ran so deep that Breuer believed the real pain of old age, bereavement, outliving one's friends, was the absence of scrutiny, the horror of living an unobserved life. Breuer says this in context of doing a physical examination of Nietzsche and reading his notes from other doctors. Let me read what Nietzsche describes. Quote, "Nietzsche described a gruesome assemblage of symptoms: monstrous, crippling headaches, seasickness on dry land, vertigo, disequilibrium, nausea, vomiting, anorexia, disgust for food, fevers, heavy night sweats which necessitated 2 or 3 nightly changes of nightshirt and linen, crushing bouts of fatigue, which at times approximated generalized muscular paralysis, gastric pain, hematemesis, intestinal cramps, severe constipation, hemorrhoids, and disabling visual problems, eye fatigue, inexorable fading of vision, frequent watering, and pain in his eyes, visual blurring, and great sensitivity to light, especially in the mornings. He also describes visual scintillations and scotomata, which often preceded a headache, intractable insomnia, severe nocturnal muscle cramps, generalized tension, and rapid, inexplicable mood shifts. What we have here, I mean, I don't even... Can you imagine living through this on a day-to-day basis? I sure can't, because this, what we see here from the get-go, is Nietzsche lived through this pain day by day by day. And though he lived by this pain, you will come to see what this pain meant for him. Nietzsche says, quote, "I have a why of living and can put up with any how. I have a 10-year point of living, a mission. I am pregnant here." He tapped his temple. "With books almost fully formed, books only I can deliver." This makes me think of another philosopher called Emil Barna, who was writing, I think it was in the 50s, and he said that the thing that helped him against suicide, protected him against suicide, was the writing of books. And in this experience, the salve of his life, the thing that protected him from suicide, from despondence, from despair. Now, mind you, he's coming in to see him of despair, but he hasn't admitted to any despair yet. In fact, he's coming to Breuer on the pretense, not on the pretense, rather, on the expectation that he's going to be treated from a medical point of view. And that's what Breuer has agreed to. Breuer has agreed to seeing him medically and then kind of smuggling in some talking cure. But Nietzsche has no understanding of this. So there's a duplicity here, which is an interesting plot line for the book. He is pregnant with books only he can deliver. Breuer considers this and is like, well, this doesn't really make sense. He doesn't seem despondent. He doesn't seem to be in despair. He seems to actually revel in his pain because he has some greater, higher purpose on what this pain means for him. And it's not something that's giving him an overburdening of despair. Or was it that he didn't feel despair, and I quote here, because he'd already decided upon suicide? Breuer had known patients like that before. They were dangerous. They appeared improved, in a sense, are improved. Their melancholia lightens, they smile, eat, sleep once more. But the improvement means they have discovered an escape from their despair, the escape of death. They've discovered an escape from their despair, an escape of death. I've seen this in people who have been highly traumatized, where it's not as if they want to die, but they want the pain, the re-experiencing, the trauma of the experience to go away. And so at times, though I have never had a person's suicide under my care to date, and I hope that never happens, but I'm quite aware that it can happen for many clinicians, and in fact does happen for many clinicians. When a person is doing really, really poorly and then they have a sudden change in mood, in affect, if they're not experiencing mania, then there might be something else going there. They may have found an out. And we see this plenty of times with people who are doing really badly, as I alluded to before, and then they find an answer to what they're struggling through, whether it's a diagnosis that actually defines what's happening for them, or whether it's an idea, or whether they find God or a reason for their living. Things change, and people call this, researchers have called this quantum change, where people make significant changes in their day-to-day because of the types of short-term, deep, and as much of the research and literature points towards, religious experiences. have given them a new reason to live. The inverse can also be observed here, where you've got an out, and that's a tough one. I tell my clients that suicide is always an option, but if you say that you're going to suicide today, then you're not just killing your current self. You are killing every single self you could ever be from now until the day that you die. And often people, they die, they suicide, they plan on dying based on a particular issue that's going on in their life at that point in time. And they are unable to see, they don't have the foresight to see that things could improve. Breuer is trying to figure out whether that's what's going on with Nietzsche. And so the story progresses with Breuer and Nietzsche having very in-depth, very deep philosophical conversations that are very practical, very, very practical. And these are conversations that are scattered through the entire book. And as you read this book, you will begin to notice that existential themes of love, hatred, guilt, of purpose and meaning, of what to do with one's life, of meaninglessness, of God, of the great divide, of hope, of trust. These are all massive themes that appear, and they're themes that come up with many people in their own lives. Let me read a quote in one of their discussions where Nietzsche says, "It is not truth that is holy, but the search for one's own truth. Can there be a more sacred act than self-inquiry? My philosophical work, some say, is built on sand. My views shift continually. But one of my granite sentences is, become who you are. And how can one discover who and what one is without the truth? Become who you are." This has become one of my granite sentences. And I think it's an important process, an important question to ask oneself. Who am I? What is it that I believe about life? What is it that I believe about myself, about other people, about the world at large? Who am I? And if you're not aware of that question, if you can't answer that question, then a lot of consideration and self-inquiry and a built-up of self-awareness needs to be part of your organizational repertoire for your future, because it only becomes an apparently important thing when you sit down and ask those questions. Who am I? What do I want? That's why so many people have midlife crises, because they spend half their life doing something that they're not happy with and they want to change that. And some people are stuck in the type of work for whatever reason, the type of work that they do not enjoy, the type of work that eats at them. And this is something that becomes incredibly dismissing of the actual purpose in life. Breuer tries to flip it and say, well, what about hope? Don't you have hope that things can change? Don't you have hope about the types of things that are going to move forward for you? Nietzsche responds, Hope is the final evil. In my book, Human, All Too Human, I suggest that when Pandora's box was opened, and that all the evils that Zeus had placed therein had escaped into man's world, there still remained, unbeknownst to anyone, one final evil: hope. Ever since then, man has mistakenly regarded the box and its contents of hope as a coffer of good fortune. But we have forgotten Zeus's wish that man continue to allow himself to be tormented. Hope is the worst of evils because it protracts torment. It protracts torment. When we hope for something, we are holding on to something that things will get better. For people who have been hurt the most, in my experience, through treating hundreds and hundreds, over 1,000 people that I've treated so far, many who have been hurt the most have the most unhealthy relationship with hope. They are skeptical of hope. They do not believe that hope is a realistic intervention for their own plot in life. And why would you? Because every time you've hoped for something, it's been turned on its head, it's been thrown onto the ground, and you're just not able to move forward with that. Whereas hope, in my experience and in my opinion and in my clinical understanding, is the only thing that can move us forward. So if you have no hope, please open yourself up and try to understand that hope is something that is not evil in its essence. In fact, hope is a move forward to understand what life is really like, what life could really be like. And only within the context of people that you trust can hope become actualized. In fact, one of my colleagues once said that they hold hope for their clients because many of the people that come to see them are at the end of their ropes. And to hope is to be let down. Let's see how Nietzsche progresses through his journey with hope. The following quote, coming from Breuer's considerations about what's going on with Nietzsche, is telling of Nietzsche's relationship with his own illness and what's actually going on in his mental life. He says, he acknowledges often being ill, but insists it's his body that's ill, not him, not his essence. As for black moods, he says he is proud of having the courage to experience black moods. Nietzsche said that the best thing he can wish on people is suffering, because suffering is instructive. If he loved somebody, he would wish suffering upon that person, because only when a person suffers, he is able to really grasp the meaning of his suffering and the meaning of his life. One person once said that only when you push a person to their limit can you start to really understand the depth of their character. And within this depth of character, you can understand what a person stands for. When you are pushed under very severe circumstances and you don't like what's happened, what you look like in the mirror, then a question is automatically asked: where do I go from here? How do I move forward from here? Because only in that context can we understand what we can truly tolerate. Another conversation happens between Breuer and Nietzsche. And in this conversation, Breuer is trying to figure out how to best help Nietzsche. And he starts to read Nietzsche's books to try to understand the thought process behind Nietzsche's utterances and how to best help him. He comes to a phrase about a footbridge in one of Nietzsche's books, and then he takes this thought process back home and meets up with Sigmund Freud and tries to have a bit of a conversation, a back and forth on what's happened. What is apparent in that, what he finds in one of Nietzsche's books. He asks Freud to close his eyes and ponder these words. Quote, "There was a time in our lives when we were so close that nothing seemed to obstruct our friendship and brotherhood, and only a small footbridge separated us. Just as you were about to step on it, I asked you, do you want to cross the footbridge to me? Immediately, you did not want to anymore, and when I asked you again, you remained silent. Since then, mountains and torrential rivers and whatever separates and alienates has been cast between us. And even if we wanted to get together, we couldn't. But when you now think of that little footbridge, words fail you, and you begin to sob and marvel." Freud starts to think about this and says, well, what are the first things that come to mind? Okay, let's footbridge. And he says this: one person is about to cross the footbridge, that is, get closer to the other person. When the second person invites him to do the very thing he planned, then the first person cannot take a step, because now it would seem as though he were submitting to the other power, apparently getting in the way of closeness. power getting in the way of closeness. This was the struggle that Breuer was having with Nietzsche. Any time that he tried to help Nietzsche, Nietzsche would pull back and say, "Nah, I don't need that." We see this often when people cannot accept compliments or cannot accept help from other people, because they would see that oftentimes, whether it's conscious or unconscious, as a play for power. If I say yes to this person, then I'm submitting to their will, to their power. So this person wants to come across a footbridge and to meet his other friend. He's made a decision. I'm gonna walk across this bridge to meet my friend. And then when the friend says, "Hey, do you want a hand?" He's like, "No, don't want to do that anymore, because now you're trying to help me, and I want to be able to do this on my own accord rather than having your help." We often see this in the counseling room when there is a vying back and forth between what a person wants and what a clinician tries to offer based on their own experiences of what they think is going to help, and then there's a back and forth, a tugging between, "Nah, that's not going to help me." I don't like I've seen this personally through many of my interactions with individuals who are saying they know what's wrong with them, what they're struggling with, what they're going through, but whenever I try to lend a hand, whenever I say, "Okay, well, why don't we try this?" "No, that's not going to work." "What about this?" "Oh, no, that's not going to work." And at some point, I stop and I reflect that back to them and say, "So I hear you saying you want help with this, and then when I lend my hand to try to help you, you're disagreeing with anything that I'm saying." And then we have a discussion around that. It's not fun. It's not a fun discussion. It's quite annoying at times if I allow it to be, but it's a very instructive conversation. And of course, I try to have that conversation and as many times as I can. And what I notice in these situations is I reflect back to the person what they're going through. I just tell them what I heard in my own words based on what they've said. And that's when people are like, yeah, that's what's going on. And then they are more willing to take that step forward. Like Nietzsche provides, if we feel powerless, then we seek power. So you've got to wonder how powerless Nietzsche felt around his social interactions, around his physical life. He had very fleeting social interactions and felt very awkward around other people. And he couldn't trust his body to perform what it needed to perform. In fact, the one thing he was very confident about, based on my limited reading I have done on Nietzsche, was his intellectual prowess. He was a very smart guy, very philosophically adept. Breuer says, and I quote, "It's a peculiar notion. It makes it almost impossible to get close to him." He says that if we feel hatred towards those who see our secrets and catch us in tender feelings, what we need at that moment is not sympathy, but to regain our power over our own emotions. This reminds me of another book that I've reviewed, Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, where anytime there is an admission of I'm helping you from a emotional point of view, the protagonist of the story, pulls back and he doesn't want to be emotional, and he belittles the person that there is emotional discussion on. And the paradox there is that the person is trying to become close to you, and then you, who want their closeness, are pushing them away because they are engaging with you. It kind of goes to show that there's a really interesting attachment dynamic there, where we can't seem to attach with the people that we are attaching to. And that's something to think about. Breuer and Freud go on to talk about Nietzsche, and Nietzsche made this observation: we need to engage in psychological surgery, quote. The seeker after truth must undergo a personal psychological analysis. He terms it moral dissection. He claims that in order to discover the truth, we must first know oneself fully. And to do that, one must remove oneself from one's customary point of view and then examine oneself from a distance. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about that, because I think what I have found when we are feeling quite emotional, and a former US Navy SEAL who now talks a lot about leadership and owning your own decisions in his book Extreme Ownership, Jocko Willink, he talks about when he's feeling emotional, what he does is he tries to take a step back and watch himself from an outsider's point of view, as if you're watching yourself through somebody else's eyes and seeing how you're reacting in that situation, to respond in a way that's unemotional. Because if you're responding in through your own body, then it makes it very difficult to remain partial and objective. This requires a significant amount of self-awareness, as I'm speaking to you right now, I'm trying to watch myself speaking with you right now. I'm making note of how I'm moving my hands, how I'm using my voice, how I am delivering my posture, the types of words that I am using. These are things that I have to be consistently aware of to be able to become more self-aware, and in turn to be able to manage my emotions so that I'm not a bleeding, crying mess while I'm trying to figure out how to put this information to you in a way that's actually going to be understandable. And as I do that, there's a process that's required to see myself as somebody else may be able to see me. And it makes it pretty simple because I'm staring at a screen right now and I can see myself as I am working, as I'm talking, as I'm exploring these ideas. And so my advice for you would be to take Nietzsche's advice, to engage in that psychological inquiry and start to discover who you are and what you stand for as somebody else may see you. Ask yourself, what am I trying to achieve from what I am doing right now, what I'm saying, what I'm delivering? And once you start to observe yourself as somebody else may observe you, you start to create a higher level of self-awareness, and through that lead to a higher level of confidence and that own internal self-confidence, confiding in yourself as a person. So up until this point of the book, you have Nietzsche and Breuer trying to establish a therapeutic relationship. And what that looks like is a toing and froing of Nietzsche not wanting to give over his control, his power to Breuer, and Breuer trying to surreptitiously include these therapeutic domains to try to hide what he already knows about Nietzsche and to ask some psychologically provocative questions about his despair and all this sort of stuff. So it's a toing and froing of intellectual minds, really interesting back and forth discussion. So if this is your thing, you would love it up until this point. Now, what is Breuer trying to do? He's trying to talk with Nietzsche about his despair, but Nietzsche refuses to acknowledge that despair is part of his symptomatic repertoire at the moment. In fact, if he talks about the really negative stuff that he's going through, he switches it on its head and says, nah, this is going to build me as a person and I'm going to become a better version of who I am. In fact, he turns a interesting quip over to Breuer and he says, quote, "To disclose oneself to another is the prelude to betrayal, and betrayal makes one sick, does it not?" So here you've got Nietzsche playing semantic acrobats with Breuer. He's trying to say, well, why the hell are you trying to get me to talk about my feelings when I'm experiencing all these devilish migraines, and the only thing that exposing myself to another person is just going to bring on another migraine, because that controls that exposure of myself, of my innermost feelings to anybody else has only ever led to really bad headaches in the past and an incredible amount of stress. And you want to get away from stress, because when you keep interacting with stressful situations, they're going to make physical situations a whole lot worse. And that's where you got the psychosomatic situation happening there. Even in these days, when you're feeling unwell, let's just say you've got a cold, and then you come home and people are screaming and people are having arguments, and they're not able to give you the time and day that you need. Your body just reacts to that, and it doesn't react kindly to that. That's where you have issues relating to those situations. It's probably not the best example. A better example could be where you work yourself up silly and you become nauseous when you're spending the whole day stressing about a project you've got coming up at work, or a presentation you need to deliver, or a client that you need to see, and you start to have tummy aches, then you're going to the toilet a whole lot more, or you need to let loose just before a meeting, you either vomit or you have diarrhea, or these sorts of psychosomatic issues. They're no small deal. And so Nietzsche's pretty equipped to make that observation. It's an interesting observation to make, and a smart one in response to Breuer. And he continues to try to argue for the utility of his illness. He says this, and I quote, "Nietzsche looked up and spoke to Breuer directly. 'Do you remember on Wednesday my sentence of granite? Become who you are? Today I tell you my second granite sentence. Whatever does not kill me makes me stronger. Thus, I say again, my illness is my blessing. What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.' You've heard this time and again, but did you know it came from Friedrich Nietzsche, a man who died in 1900 after a 10-year bout of forgetfulness that was precipitated by a syphilis condition. He didn't even know who he was towards the end, and his mental state deteriorated significantly. So much so that he spent the last 10 years of his life in a psychiatric facility and died a terrible, painful, and debilitating death. Nobody wants that. Nobody, well, you can say we wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy. Depending on how bad your enemies are, you might question that one. But let's just say that this guy had it bad, and he came up with that granite sentence, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger. My illness is a blessing." Okay, great. What does that even mean? Breuer asks him, "Well, what do you mean by that? Like, what's going on here?" And he tries to make sense of what Nietzsche is trying to postulate. He says, and I quote, "As I understand you, Professor Nietzsche, you do not describe choosing an illness so much as you describe conquering and benefiting from one. Am I correct?" Nietzsche retorts back to him, "I do speak of conquering or overcoming an illness. But as to choosing, I'm not sure. Perhaps one does choose an illness. It depends on who the one is. The psyche does not function as a single entity. Part of our mind may operate independently from others. Perhaps I and my body form the conspiracy behind the back of my own mind." Here you have that question. Okay, you're trying to make do with what you've got. You've been dealt a set of cards. That's the hand you've been dealt, and you want to make the best of it. But are you choosing your illness? And Nietzsche tries to contemplate, well, I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm choosing my illness. It's not like I wished it to be. Who wants to be there experiencing the type of torment that he experienced on a day-to-day basis, where over 250 days of the year he was in extreme agony and torment. He could only remember a few days of a particular year, a few weeks of a particular year where he wasn't in pain. It's a deadly disease that he had, one that ultimately cost him his life. Though there is some discussion around that, so I not as a Nietzsche scholar, I can't can't make a conclusive discussion around that. There are many postulations on how he died and where he died, but that's beside the point. What I would say is that he starts to think about this. Well, did I choose my illness? Well, do I choose my illness? Has it served me in a positive way? And he actually brings up a bunch of examples where his illness has served him well, where he's in a room alone and he's able to focus on his writing, where he had to leave his university and garner a pension that required him not to work and focus on his books, where he was able to be discharged from military service because he was unable to live through that military life with his illness. These are all benefits that he says, well, maybe this illness actually does serve me well. It's not that I'm thriving despite it, but often because of it. Maybe my body is plotting against me. Maybe my brain is plotting against me and bringing something up that is actually going to serve me well. And here you have, again, a interesting dichotomy between the mind and the body, and how the body starts to attack the mind, and how there's a distinction between that. I mean, Nietzsche is wondrous, and it just reminds me I need to do more reading into Nietzsche's works, because this book is a beautiful representation of the ideas that he espouses, and very practical ideas as I see them. And so now Breuer realizes he's lost the plot. He's not going to change Nietzsche's mind. He's not going to make a difference in Nietzsche's day-to-day. What he wants to do is actually just start learning from him. He says, and I quote, "Stay calm. Don't try to outwit him. He's too clever by half. Don't argue, you will lose. And even if you win, you lose." And that other Nietzsche, the one who wants to die but pleads for help, the one you promised to help, that Nietzsche is not here now. Don't try to speak to him. We fast forwarded a bit more in the story, where Nietzsche goes through a devastating migraine attack, and during that migraine attack he pleads for help from Breuer, and Breuer brings that migraine under control, and Nietzsche loses memory of asking Breuer for help. And Breuer, what he does is, I need to approach this in a different way. I can't just try to argue philosophically with him and try to reason him out of this situation. We need to appeal to his heart, and we need to flip the table. So he devises a play saying, well, I'm going to start to learn from you, and I'm going to tell you something that I'm dealing with, and I want you to heal me. I want you to help me. Enter the tale of the two healers that Yalom was really inspired by. So he tells Nietzsche, there's a lady, Bertha Poppenheim, and this is the person that we've spoken about before. She keeps playing on my mind. I no longer see her. She's been transferred to a new facility, and it's causing significant stress in my family. I spent way too much time with her, and I can't seem to be done with her. My wife is jealous. I'm neglecting my wife, my kids, and all I do is become tormented by these thoughts that I can't seem to get rid of in my mind. And in that vein, he's like, well, can you help me with this? And Nietzsche reluctantly agrees to help him using his own philosophy. And thereby we have a majestic exploration into the potential Nietzschean therapy that ensues, that is existentially based, and that is a remarkable giant of a therapy that we'll see has its own issues, because it's very up here. And we know, we've talked about how the body is the thing that keeps a score of our issues, of our trauma. And in fact, that's what Breuer is going through. He's having a whole bunch of things that are going on in his brain, but he's also losing sleep over it. He's also feeling anxious about it. He's contemplating death. He is asking, he doesn't know where to go in his own life. He brings up a bunch of bullet points towards Nietzsche and says, hey, help me with this, and this. I'm unsatisfied with my life. I've gotten a lot out of my achievements, but I'm not able to to feel satisfaction. I feel like I just want to leave and become myself. And even though I have a beautiful wife, I don't want to be with her. I don't want to make love to her. I don't want anything to do with her. And I'm constantly thinking of this client, this patient that I had, and yada yada yada. It's a tough paradigm to be in at that point. And so Nietzsche agrees, and so begins a story, a exploration into how Nietzsche begins to help Breuer. Now, as this relationship ensues, Breuer is constantly going back and forth at home with his wife, with his discussions with Freud, and they have quite in-depth discussions about what's going on with Nietzsche. After Freud says, "Hey, Joseph, why are you so upset with where you are at, with what's going on for you? Because you're at atop the very crest of life. Look at you. Everyone wants to be like you. Men want to be you. Women want to be with you. This is a thing that just doesn't make sense." Breuer responds, "The crest of life, you've put it right, Sig. The crest, the summit of the life climb. But the problem with crests is that they lead downhill. From the crest, I can see all the rest of my years stretched out before me, and the view doesn't please me. I see only aging, diminishment, fathering, grandfathering." When Breuer looks forward, he doesn't see hope. He sees a ruinous Mordor of a land where there is darkness, a land where there is diminishment, a land that behind him there's greenery and beauty, but in front of him there's death and destruction. And he's afraid of this. He doesn't want to live that life, and so he contemplates death, he contemplates suicide, he contemplates living a life that's worthy of starting over and choosing the life that he wants to choose. But then he also feels stuck in his marriage, stuck with his obligations, stuck in his practice. All that sort of stuff keeps compounding and becoming a massive stumbling block over his life. And Sig just can't make sense of it. Sigmund Freud can't make sense of it. Sig is an endearing name that Breuer puts upon him. And so they start to figure out, well, how do we move forward from there? Asking Freud's opinions on this. And so what Freud says is, well, maybe the unconscious consciousness is trapped inside your patient. That unconscious part of the person is trapped in wanting to come out, that part that he's not aware of. And how do you move forward with that? Breuer says, well, maybe that should be the goal of treatment, to liberate the hidden consciousness, to allow him to ask for help in the daylight. And so now we're back at Breuer trying to help him in a subtle way by pretending to allow Nietzsche to think that he's helping him. So there's so much duplicity in this one that it makes you scratch your head and figure out, well, what's actually happening here? Who's helping who? And we'll find out what the answer is to that as we go on. But many of you, very adept at reading forward, would have already guessed the outcomes of this story. Freud retorts back to Joseph, but is liberation the term? After all, he has no separate existence. He is an unconscious part of himself. Isn't integration what we're after? Integration of the unconscious? So what I want to pause there a little bit, because integration is the key of any type of therapy. We all have different parts that are at play within ourselves, and not just part of therapy, but part of who we are as a person. If we have a part that hates something and then another part that wants something, we see this all the time with drug use. I hate what the drug's doing to me, but I love what it brings to me. We have two different parts that are at play. Or I hate this bloody work, but it's giving me money. Or I hate this bloody government, but at the same time, it's employing me, or it's keeping me safe, or it's whatever it's doing. There's a whole bunch of different parts of ourselves that we're trying to balance, and this is all happening in an unconscious way. We're not just one unity. We are a conglomerate of parts that come together, and one part may be louder than another part, and so we have the angry part that's a whole lot louder than the kind and calm part. But you can get into that calm headedness when things are going really well, and so it's about integrating these parts, about balancing these and starting to bring them together to become a unity rather than a dichotomy, or a trichotomy, or a infinite dichotomy of things. And so there's an agreement. Integration is the key. And the best way to integrate what's going on with Nietzsche is to try to bring up themes in Breuer's own life that Nietzsche can relate to. And perhaps by helping Breuer, Nietzsche can begin to help himself. In one of the final moments of a session that Nietzsche has with Breuer, he poses a thought experiment. He says this, quote, "For tomorrow's discussion, please consider this question. If you were not thinking these alien thoughts, what would you be thinking instead?" If you were not thinking these alien thoughts, what would you be thinking instead? Oftentimes we are so preoccupied with the barrage of thoughts that keep pummeling us that we have little hope of capturing what else is out there. Oftentimes when people are very depressed or anxious, anxiety often being a fear about the future, whereas depression is often a rumination of the past and present situations, they lose sight of what's happening in the here and now. So they may be with you right now. They may be having a coffee, sharing a meal. They may be apparently there, but you can see that they're somewhere else. And often it's because they're tied up with their own thoughts, their own memories, their own fears, that they appear dissociated. They have no other opportunity to experience the here and now. And what we see with Nietzsche's question, if you were not thinking about Bertha, for example, which is one of the main issues that, as we said, Breuer brought towards him, then what would you be thinking of instead? What would you have enough time to consider if you weren't doing this? I often pose these questions to my own clients where, if you weren't doing this particular thing, what could you be doing instead? If you weren't using a drug, if you weren't wasting your time at work, if you weren't procrastinating, what could you be doing instead? And then how do you organize the situation so that you're more likely to step into that, because it's an action-based outcome rather than anything you can think yourself out of. We see that Breuer's try to think himself out of these situations time and time again. He wakes up in the middle of the night and he has a thought, where death is, there I am not. Something that he learned from a philosopher back in the day. And that doesn't help him. He can't think himself out of these situations. So what comes out of it? Breuer often doesn't understand these experiments that Nietzsche is trying to throw at him, because Nietzsche's just thinking them up in that moment, at that spot, and trying to figure out, okay, based on my philosophy, what's going to happen if you do this? And then the next session, all right, what about this? And what about this? And Breuer doesn't seem to be able to take that on board. Nietzsche says to him in another session that they have together, another conversation, quote, "You want to fly, but you cannot begin to fly by flying. I must first teach you to walk. And the first step is learning to walk is to understand that he who does not obey himself is ruled by others. It is far easier to obey another than to command oneself." These sorts of philosophies that Nietzsche is espousing, that it is much easier to obey another person than it is to command yourself, come from his thinking around what our obligation is as a person. He says that we humans can be represented by three three beings. The first being is a camel. A camel is something that bears the burden of everything else, something that is able to carry everyone else's expectations, everyone else's burdens, and it's a beast of burden for the rest of their life until they die and the next one replaces them. And we often go throughout our lives carrying the expectations of other people as they have been placed on us, these shoulds of existence. You should do this or you should have done that, rather than these coulds that we can grasp for ourselves. I could be doing this or I could be doing that, depending on what it is that is important for me. We don't operate from a should perspective when we are fully actualized, when we are essentially ourselves, when we have become who we are. But we often ask the question, well, what is it that I could do in this situation? Nietzsche rails against this sense of being a camel, bearing everybody else's expectations, the culture that you are in, the religion that you are ascribed to, the person, the parent, the influencer. He's all about becoming yourself and deciding on what it is that you want to do, because far easy it is to say, yes, I can do this, this, and this, and this. And humans are very, very adept at trying to highlight what is one thing I can do based on this particular framework. Give me the A's, give me the B's, give me the C's. Help me understand this formula, and I'll follow that formula, and we'll be good. Nietzsche's all against that sort of stuff. Nietzsche talks about lions. So this is a second being. This is a second entity that Nietzsche says we go through a development of. And a lion roars. A lion tells one what it wants. And that's an important transition, because going from a camel to a lion is a huge step, because you've got to step up and say, no, this is what I want. And if I do not achieve this particular thing, then I'm going to make a lot of noise. So you need to know what it is that you want. You need to have that air of self-confidence to be able to stand up for yourself. And people who can fall into a very agreeable nature from a personality point of view find it very difficult to stand up for what it is that they believe in and adjust that as a way of moving forward. But that's a short-term process for Nietzsche anyway, roaring and telling people what you want. There's only so long you can keep that up for. There's only so many pitchforks you can carry. There's only so many signs you can blare across to other people. There are only so many times you can shout out. He says that the culmination, and this is a bit paradoxical, is to become a baby. And when you are a baby, you are able to decide what it is that you want to do, and others will adapt based on your needs rather than the needs of their own anxieties and their own expectations and the rest of that. It's about standing up and becoming who you are at a very base point of view. Now, whether or not we agree with that, and whether or not I have represented that in a way that Nietzsche would have nodded his head to, remains to be seen. What I am really interested in putting forward is Nietzsche's like, well, you can't just step forward into one area of development without first learning another area. We need to learn how to walk before we can run. We need to learn the basics before we go into the complexities of the things that we are interested in. And that 1% principle that I talk about a lot is that what's that one thing you can do better each day? Just as James Clear in his book Atomic Habits talks about. Choose one thing, do it over and over again, and then you become proficient at it. That's Nietzsche's point here. Following on from this, they go into discussion about theology and God and becoming a free person. He says that, quote, you must choose between comfort and true inquiry. If you choose science, if you choose to be liberated from the soothing chains of the supernatural, if, as you claim, you choose to eschew belief and embrace godlessness, then you cannot in the same breath yearn for the small comforts of the believer. If you kill God, you must leave the shelter of the temple. This one really stands out for me because it would be remiss to go through this review and not talk about Nietzsche's disgust with organized religion. For Nietzsche, he pronounced the death of God. And often people believe that he was glad at this pronouncement, but no, he wasn't. He was devastated at the prospect of what will replace religion and God if we have killed him. He said, "What are we to do, murderer of all murderers? How are we to live our life moving forward?" That's a paraphrase. He said, if you kill God, you must also leave the shelter of the temple. And if you've left the shelter of the temple and you leave the comfort that that brings you, Nietzsche seems to have the idea that God in his existence or non-existence, people draw comfort from that. And that's something that Karl Marx tended to argue, that the religion is the opiate of the people, that religion pacifies and makes you unaware of what's actually going on in the wide world, and it's not a useful thing. A similar kind of understanding comes from Freud later in his writings, where religion was just something that God became a replacement for the father that you grew up with, and it served a sort of evolutionary function where you feel good when you're laying your fears and your concerns on something else other than yourself, and that's the only type of reward you get from a religious entity. It doesn't seem that, at least in the reading of this book, that there is a discussion around the reasons why God does not exist. The discussion is mainly focused on, well, you need to leave that temple, you need to find a new place, and don't worry about your own comfort and the rules that everyone places on you. It's about finding your own way forward. And wherever you stand when it comes to God, spirituality, the applicability of this is very important, because when you leave something that you have once drawn comfort from, then you have to find some new way of finding that comfort, drawing that comfort. In specializing with addiction, I often see that when people leave the comfort, the non-judgmental mattress of support that they have within their own drug-using circles, they go out, they use a drug, and people they don't feel judged. They feel judged by everybody else, but not the people who they use drugs with, and that keeps them there. But there's a paradox, because there's also a really negative element to drug use that they want to get rid of. And when they leave that, the safety of that, they strive, they want to connect with something else, something deeper, something that they have found in part within their own drug using circles, but they can't find because they really have to renegotiate their life and find new people, new places. When you leave the temple, where is it that you go? The discussion ensues, and Breuer says this: "You say, Professor Nietzsche, that growth is the reward of pain." But Nietzsche interrupts and says, "No, not just growth. There is also strength. A tree requires stormy weather if it is to attain a proud height. And creativity and discovery are begotten in pain." For Nietzsche, strength is the more important thing rather than just growth. When you experience something that throws you onto the ground, he argues that just as a tree is strengthened through the storm that it experiences, that just lays against its trunk, so too does a human, that when they are able to feel deeply, then they're able to be buffered against the pain as you move forward. Breuer responds, "Yes, I grasp your meaning intellectually. Yes, there are rewards of pain, growth, strength, creativity. I understand it here, but it doesn't get into here. It doesn't get into my feeling." And this is where we have the tension between the head and the heart, where we may understand something consciously. But in terms of feeling, that's the really difficult one to encompass, because you truly have to feel something to be moved by it. People have most likely told you at some point in their life, that at some point in your life, that you need to do X, Y, and Z, and you're like, yeah, well, that sounds like a great idea, but this isn't something that I feel like I can do at this moment in time. Or just stop thinking about something. Okay, great. Teach me. How do you do that? How do I feel it? How do I match the feeling with the thought? Or if you don't feel like doing something, it's often, but it's something that you need to do. You need to give up a drink. You need to say sorry. You need to patch things up with somebody else. You need to get into an assignment that you need to do. You need to see a client that you don't really want to see. There's that conscious attribution that, yes, I need to do this, but I don't feel like doing it. What do you do then? You need to bridge that crevice. And how do you bridge that crevice is a matter of sitting with it, to feel it in a particular way that you haven't yet before. And that's fully encompassing your experience, often through a mindfulness practice that I often do with my own clients, where we sit down, we bring up what it is that they're struggling with, we dig into it, even from a Socratic method, just keep asking questions. What does this mean to you? What does this mean to you? And get to the bottom of what it is that you feel, and why you feel what you feel, and where you feel it in your body, and if you feel it in your body at some point in time. And then you begin to slowly match the head and the heart. And that's the important bit, delving into the body, but becoming aware of what's actually going on in your body. Because people who don't have an understanding of what they're feeling, that alexithymic feeling that people experience at certain points in time, not being able to attribute what they're feeling in certain situations, alexithymia is the term, and not being able to name their emotions, not being able to name a feeling. When someone says, how are you feeling? Well, good. Bad. It's very generic, rather than my heart's racing and I feel like my gut's pulling, or my jaw is clenching. These sorts of things are more important to highlight. And the best way to understand this is to move forward through that feeling and to appreciate that feeling, rather than be thrown away from it. Nietzsche throws Breuer a wake-up call. And I'm just going to read this without any commentary, because I really want us to sit with it. Don't you see, Yosef, that the problem is not that you feel discomfort? What importance is tension or pressure in your chest? Who ever promised you comfort? So you sleep poorly, so? Whoever promised you good sleep? No, the problem is not discomfort. The problem is that you have discomfort about the wrong thing. The problem is that you have discomfort about the wrong thing. They meet another day, and Yosef has been thinking about what Nietzsche has been saying, and he says this. Sometimes I imagine everyone has a secret phrase, Friedrich, a deep motive that becomes the central myth of one's life. When I was a child, someone once called me the lad of infinite promise. I loved that phrase. I've hummed it to myself 1,000 times. Often I've imagined myself as a tenor singing it in high pitch. I like to say it slowly, dramatically, emphasizing each syllable. What's happened to that lad of infinite promise? Friedrich asks. That question, I ponder it often. What has become of him? I know now that there is no more promise. It's all been used up. Here we see how what has been leveled at you can begin to reverberate throughout our lives, and you begin to latch onto things that people have told you or that you've told yourself, and whether that's a positive or a negative thing, and then we begin to adjust our life based on that situation. When we live our life based upon the expectations of other people, or even the expectations that we place, the unreasonable expectations that we place within ourselves, we run the risk of having a incredibly deferential life. It's a very difficult process to encapsulate because we have many individuals, many of my own clients who have unrelenting standards, these standards that they shove to the highest level possible, and they expect those of themselves, they expect these of other people, and when people do not live within the framework of their own expectations, and it makes it more difficult for these individuals to start to live a happy life. And this happy life is fleeting for most of us, and of course with Breuer, he has this lad of infinite promise expectation that he places upon himself. He's achieved most of it, and now it's like, well, where has that person gone? I'm right at the peak of my mountain, but the problem with being at the peak is that you see the incline below, you see what's over the other side. And when we see what's on the other side of these peaks, then you got to really question yourself, well, is this the mountain that I should be on at the moment? Is this the mountain that I could be on? Or are there other mountains that I choose to move forward with? Breuer goes on to say that, quote, "At first the flush of a new success lasted for months, but gradually it has grown more fleeting, weeks, then days, even hours, until now the feeling evaporates so quickly that it no longer even penetrates my skin. I now believe my goals were imposters." Imposters, that's an interesting word. The imposter syndrome. These things that we ascribe to, that many very high-level individuals ascribe to, especially if they've got an unrelenting standard schema, which is a schema, a view of the world that we need to achieve the utmost to be able to really just be worthwhile, be worthy of our achievements. And if not, if we don't feel it, and this is the head and the heart separation, our actions line up with what it is that we're supposed to be doing. We may look a particular way, or have achieved something at work, or we may have the perfect cookie cutter family, that white picket fence, but we just don't feel it inside. We feel like an imposter. We feel like we're adding to our life by taking things away. And the thing that we're taking away is our own confidence within ourselves. We're not able to confide in even what we think we need to do. I see this a lot in clinical practice when people are unsatisfied with their achievements, and the achievements that they've had is what they thought they were aiming for to begin with, but then they come to later realize this isn't something that works for me, this isn't something that will be sustainable, and it leads to a questioning and a crisis within oneself, an existential crisis that is unable to be filled. And then you do achieve something and it becomes less and less of a satisfaction. It becomes less happiness inducing. And so we're going through the ropes, but we're not really achieving anything that we set out to achieve, at least in terms of how we feel about who we are. And the feeling is an important one, because there are many psychological experiments that have been undertaken where you have this process of fake it till you make it, where you act in accordance to how you would like to be perceived. And then once you've acted in that way, then you become perceived as that which you are trying to act with. If you're feeling incredibly depressed, straightening up your posture, bringing your shoulders back and your chin up can exude a sense of self-confidence. Or a person who's unhappy, if they're able to smile a little bit, will start to change their physiological state, because your body doesn't know whether you are upset or not. It acts based on the physiological output that you're putting. So a smile can actually shift a person's feeling state so that they're feeling a whole lot different than what they started off with. There have been job interview experiments where the experimenters advise people who are just going into a job interview to go into the restrooms and to stand up straight in a power pose. And a power pose could be just the hands on the shoulders with the chest up, and for about 2 to 3 minutes. And then to go into the interview and see how they perform. Well, these people who went into the interview performed a heck of a lot better and felt a whole lot more confident just because of that shift in posture. You see the same with kids who are in elementary school, in primary school. There were experiments that were undertaken with children who were asked to complete their test while slouching and kind of laying down on the table while completing the test. And then another set of kids were asked to sit up straight with their shoulders back and complete the assessment like that. And the people who just had that posture of upright, they weren't told that this is a confidence posture, but they were just told to get into that posture. They actually performed a lot better in the test than people who are slouching. And that's the same with other types of experiments, the blue eye, brown eye experiments by Jane Elliott, who put kids into 2 groups, and they said, well, blue eyes are smarter, are more likable, are better than brown-eyed kids. And then she flipped it the next day that the brown-eyed kids were better and vice versa. So what they saw is that the brown-eyed kids, when they were on the top position, actually performed a hell of a lot better than the blue-eyed kids. And the same was seen when they flipped the switch. But even better, they performed better than they had performed in the previous day. So they may have gone, say, 5 out of 10 in the first day on a particular test, or they completed a set of cards a lot quicker on the days that they were seeing themselves as a positive, as the people who are smarter, as the people who were more confident, versus the days where they weren't that way. And so what does that mean for this book here? How do we make sense of who we are based on where we stand? Well, Breuer hasn't got anything to prove. He's more just trying to feel better about himself as a person. And in understanding who he is, he just wants to get back to living within his own right, within his own set of expectations and standards, and just finding out what those standards are. That's a good first step. As the story progresses, there's more nuggets of wisdom that appear here. One comes from Breuer as he considers Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, and he says this: he has always been contemptuous of philosophers like Kant and Hegel, who wrote, he said, with an academic stylus solely for the academic community. His philosophy was about life and for life. The best truths, he always said, were bloody truths, ripped out of one's own life experience. The best truths were bloody truths, ripped out of one's own life experience. I want to sit with that for a second, because when we sit with our own personal experience, we can start to move forward more so than if somebody tells us, hey, do this and do that and do this because it's going to be good for you. We need to have that lived experience in many arenas of our life to be able to make the change. And this is where the head and the heart need to align. If they aren't aligned, then your philosophy is for naught. And Nietzsche got really frustrated with people who would just talk about things that just didn't really matter to life. He was more interested in what is applicable in day-to-day life, which makes him the people's philosopher. And I think from a psychotherapeutic bent, this is very practical, that we can distinguish what to do and how to move forward with it. Kind of like what a CBT therapist would do, a cognitive behavioral therapist, which would identify what the person's struggling with and come up with very practical points to try out and then review and then revisit the next day. Or an existential psychotherapist would do, to ask deeper questions in life and what gives you purpose, meaning and value, and how do you maximize this in your day-to-day. Breuer and Nietzsche make their way to a cemetery, just as part of their day-to-day visits. Cemetery helps Breuer kind of unwind a little bit and puts things into perspective. He has I think it's a monthly ritual of laying flowers on his parents' grave. Even though he doesn't necessarily believe in ritual or the religious element, he's a secularist, and Nietzsche tends to spark up a conversation with Breuer. And one of the things that comes out in that conversation, or really in one of the observations that Breuer makes, is the following. I'm going to read it for you. Breuer gestured towards the bouquets of fresh cut flowers that lay before many graves. In this land of the dead, these are the dead. And those, he pointed to an old, untended and abandoned section of the cemetery. Those are the truly dead. No one tends their graves because no one living has ever known them. They know what it means to be truly dead. I mentioned this in a previous review when I was reviewing Notes from Underground. In his book Love's Executioner, Irvin Yalom carried this point, and you can see it as a one-to-one parallel to what Breuer is saying here. Yalom recounts the story of a lady. She laments on her passing, and what she says is this: someday soon, perhaps in 40 years, there will be no one alive who has ever known me. That's when I will be truly dead, when I exist in no one's memory. I thought a lot about how someone very old is the last living individual to have known some person or cluster of people. When that person dies, the whole cluster dies too, vanishes from living memory. I wonder who that person will be for me, whose death will make me truly dead. Breuer has these thoughts, and they're truly scary for a person who looks on the other side of the abyss and sees nothing but age and rot and disintegration into nothingness. Who will be that person? We can ask ourselves, what impact have we made in our life that will help our name continue on, if it is something that you believe in? But even if it isn't, even if you don't really count your time here on earth as of much significance at all, or not really wanting to have your name live past your death, it is an important question to ask: what do I want to do with my life today to help me truly live towards a future that's going to be better off, leaving the world a little bit better off than it was when I entered into it? Nietzsche reflects on his experience in the cemetery, and he says, "It's strange, Joseph, how I'm always soothed by a cemetery. I told you my father was a Lutheran minister. But did I also tell you that my backyard and play area was a village churchyard? And do you know Montaigne's essay on death? Well, he advises us to live in a room with a window overlooking a cemetery. It clears one's head, he claims, and keeps life's priorities in perspective." I've often thought about this afterwards. What is the utility of visiting a cemetery? And anytime I've been to a cemetery, it's always been when we have buried somebody or we're visiting somebody. But how often do I take the time to sit, to walk through the stones and to really contemplate the people that have once lived? It's whenever I have done that, it's a truly contemplative experience that brings about a lot of perspective, as Montaigne would have said, that philosopher. And I think that's what Nietzsche is getting at here. When we live on the other side of death, then we know how to truly consider our life. Death being that great equalizer. It is in this cemetery visit that Nietzsche poses his famous demon in the middle of the night experiment. And this is how Yalom frames it. Joseph, try to clear your mind. Imagine this thought experiment. What if some demon were to say to you that this life, as you now live it and have lived it in the past, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it. And every pain, every joy, everything unutterably small and great in your life will return to you all in the same succession and sequence. Even this wind and those trees and the slippery shale, even the graveyard and the dread, even this gentle move, even this gentle moment, and you and I, arm in arm, murmuring these words. Imagine the eternal hourglass of existence, turned upside down again and again and again, and each time also turned upside down are you and I, mere specks that we are. In his book, The Gay Science, Nietzsche poses this precise question, except it's imagine waking up in the middle of the night and you are given the opportunity to live your life again and again and again with no ability to change what it is that has happened. Each succession, each thing would happen in the same succession as it had happened the first time, and it will happen for all eternity. How would you react? Would you throw yourself on the floor and curse this demon that night that you are woken up in, curse your very existence? Or would you be welcoming of this prospect? For Nietzsche, and if you really think about it for yourself, do you look back at your life and you consider what you have done up until that point in time that you are considering this question? Is it and has it been worthwhile? Would you do the same things over and over again? Are there regrets? Are there no regrets? If you were given the opportunity to live again and again, would you be proud? Or would it strike fear? And if it does strike fear, what can you do today to help you forge a better tomorrow? This is the power of this thought experiment for Nietzsche. And in fact, this is what he proposes to Breuer as they walk into their cemetery, reminded of death and life and the ability to actualize one's life in this short speck of time that we have here on earth. That's one of their final conversations before the close of the book. And the book closes in a way that isn't too surprising. It is a coming together of two minds. Breuer tells Nietzsche that he has been duplicitous, and his the real circumstances that brought him, which was Lou Salome, and how that truth-telling was a reconciliation, because it was a very big risk that Breuer had taken in telling Nietzsche the circumstances of him coming to therapy. It was not therapy back in those days, but it's a very interesting portrayal of how the therapeutic dynamic began. And Nietzsche in himself let loose and said, well, I have also been duplicitous. I too came into this not telling you who I was and what had hurt me, and the impact of women in my own life, and Lou Salome, and love and hatred, and the things that I have been experiencing. And I kind of pretended to have it all together, but in the end I was trying to help myself by fixing you. Physician, heal thyself. That's what this book appears to be about, at least in my mind. And so, as we spoke about in the start of this review, it's a really great portrayal of the two physicians who set out to meet one another because they were unsatisfied with their own life. And so Irvin Yalom does it again and again in his writings, where he is able to deep dive into these therapeutic elements and bring about a new way of thinking about therapy, about connecting with others, about the historicity. History is fiction that did happen. Fiction is history that might have happened. And this story very well could have happened. I'll leave you with that. If you benefited out of today's exploration into when Nietzsche wept, please hit the subscribe button, share this around, hit like, and follow me and engage with me in the comments below, and give me your indication of what it is that you got out of this review and in reading this book. And if you haven't read this book, please go ahead and do it. From a psychotherapeutic point of view, it's an amazing way forward into just developing your mind on how therapy looked like in the first place, or might have looked like in the first place. Until next time, see you later.